don't know, got something in my throat. Good morning. Since I'm having to look at the screen while I do this, I can actually see if you have questions. So if you have a question and you want to ask it, just ask it in that chat box, and I will do my best to look up there every once in a while, and if you see a question, I'll answer it. We'll wait until it's straight up 8 before we jump back into the path to independence. Okay, according to the second computer, it is actually 8 o'clock, so we'll get started. We still haven't heard results from the person I might have been exposed to, so I'm still here. But that's okay. I put a couple of things on Blackboard for y'all. They're all cartoons. But if we'd been in class today, I would have played Schoolhouse Rock for you. And then in a couple of days, I would play another Schoolhouse Rock for you, because there's two that are appropriate for this time, and they're entertaining. And so I put those on. I also put a cartoon series called Liberty's Kids. I put a link to that on there. As we get into the Revolutionary War, this is a cartoon series that actually covers the Revolutionary War. And it's pretty good. It's a little biased. There's a few things in it that probably would not have happened. But for the most part, it's a good overview. And it helps you keep the characters straight, because we start talking about a lot of names in here. And I think they did a good job of picking people to play the parts, and they got big names. Walter Cronkite is Ben Franklin, I believe. Arnold Schwarzenegger is in it. There's a lot of big names in this cartoon series. It's pretty cool. So that's on there. Neither is required. At least watch the first episode of Liberty's Kids. You might see a question about that. And I'll probably try to come up with a little 5 or 10 point extra credit quiz, particularly over that one, over the first one. It's the Boston Tea Party. So, wow, it looks like everybody is here. Obviously, I didn't figure out the whole PowerPoint on one screen with YouTube Live. Too much sugar for a nickel. It was not intuitive, and I couldn't quite figure it out. So I may work on it if I'm stuck here for another week, but we'll probably just stick with this. And I'll get the rest of the slides for this section up pretty quick. Okay, so we were talking about how King George had come into power. Everybody's happy. The French and Indian Wars is over. But in England, they're deciding, hey, these colonists need to start paying for some of their defense. And Grenville is the new chief minister. He orders customs officials to tighten down on collecting customs, orders the Navy to start capturing smugglers a little more efficiently, And they set up a new Vice Admiralty Court in Halifax. That's in the new part that the British have, not in any of the 13 colonies. And it's going to be the court for all the colonies. So if you screw up in Georgia, you're going to find yourself hauled to Halifax to be tried. Not tried by a jury of your peers. You're going to be tried in an admiralty court. So it's fair to say that the era of salutary neglect has ended. The British are paying a little more attention to the colonies. Now, the colonies are still, the American colonies are still not the highest priority for England. They have a lot going on just in England. But they're paying a little bit more attention. And there are a few acts, some of them are quite old, that have been passed that are giving the colonists pause. Now, the colonists are reacting to all of this. Well, we'll get into that. Okay, so first there's the Molasses Act. The Molasses Act is one of the old ones. It goes back to 1733. And the Molasses Act taxes molasses and sugar. You need those to make rum. Rum is a very good trade item. But the amount of tax, even the English could see, was a threat to New England prosperity. Greenville recognized this and replaces it with the Revenue Act of 1764. The colonists call it the Sugar Act. It reduces the duty in half with the hopes that that would reduce the temptation to smuggle. But you know, paying half or paying none, none still looks pretty good. It added duties, though, on foreign textiles, wine, coffee, indigo, and sugar. So it's not just, it reduced the duty on molasses. It's the first act that Parliament passes to actually raise revenue and not just regulate trade. Regulating trade had been accepted by the colonists, but this is a tax to raise revenue. They're raising more than they need to just to keep trade safe. It didn't work as it was planned. It cost 4 times as much to administer as it raised, mostly because the taxes had to be collected in the colonists, which meant you had to pay tax collectors to live in the colonies. There were transportation costs back and forth. And it didn't do anything to slow down the smuggling. The next act was the Currency Act of 1764. We've talked about how there was not enough coin in the colonies to go around, and most of that went to England to pay debt. So the colonists had started printing paper money. They started printing paper money. It varied from colony to colony. Each colony printed their own. So, you know, if you were in Virginia, you might not accept Massachusetts currency, or you might not accept it on face value. It was causing some issues. English merchants didn't want to accept it at all. And in 1764, Parliament passed a law that the colonies could no longer print money. Well, that essentially made all the printed money that people were using at the time invalid. Why take money that you don't have to? And it was a very deflationary act. And the colonists have done pretty good during the war. Wartime is really good for an economy, but the war is over and they're facing a post-war slump. So really hurt. Okay, I'm changing slides. At least I think I'm changing slides. No. I'm working with two of the oldest computers on the planet of the Earth, and they are so slow. I'm sorry. All right, so Currency Act. Next was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was another tax to raise money. There's no other way about it. That is all it was to raise money. And the Stamp Act required that to sell anything, basically anything paper, pamphlets, newspapers, cards, even playing cards, books, you had to affix a tax stamp to it. If it was sold without the stamp, it was sold illegally. And you paid a cent or two for the stamp. It gets added into the cost. And this one hit everybody. Now, the Sugar Act, that was mostly a New England issue. The Currency Act, to a point, was New England, even though everybody was making money. The Stamp Act affects all of the colonies, and it is strictly to raise money. The next act is the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act required the colonists to provide housing and provisions for the troops. Either put them in build barracks, put them in hotels, but you had to house and feed the British troops that were still in the colonies. And this mostly affects New York because that's where most of the troops were at the time. All of these together really perturbed the colonists. Now, they weren't necessarily opposed to helping pay for their own defense, but they wanted to pay for it as Englishmen. They wanted representation in Parliament. And this outrages a lot of Americans, and not all, but a lot. And the radical ideas of those real Whigs, the Whigs that we talked about on Monday during our brief conversation, those ideas were starting to take hold in the colonies. The ideas of Locke, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. That there are rights that, okay, I've missed a slide, so let's go to the next slide. There's rights that even the king can't threaten. And these ideas are starting to take hold, really take hold. They also didn't like having the redcoats left in the colonies. At the time, a standing army was what monarchs used to control their people. That was a tool of despots, and so they didn't like that. They felt they had fought, they had militias, they could protect themselves. They didn't need the redcoats there to help enforce all of these new acts that were being forced upon them. The idea of a trial by jury had been taken away with the Admiralty Courts. That is a long-held English common law custom to have a trial by a jury of your peers, and that's gone. Obviously, taxation without representation. They don't have people in Parliament. Parliament is passing taxes that are to raise revenue, not just to regulate trade. They're not feeling included. So you start to see this group of people who are protesting and grumbling about the mother country. And protests start arising. The Stamp Act is the main target. Nobody is happy with the Stamp Act because it affects everybody. The customs officials, particularly in Boston, Boston is like the hotbed for all of this. They create an effigy of the stamp collector. So an effigy is a big dummy, basically made of cloth, straw, whatever, that looks enough like the person, or they put a label on it that says, "Hey, this is Tax Collector Joe," and they parade him through the streets of Boston, and they end up hanging him for a while in a big tree. This tree, which I believe in Boston is an elm, is going to become known as the Liberty Tree. Eventually, they take the stamp collector down from his noose and they burn him at the stake, which is, I guess, much preferable to actually burning the stamp collector customs official at the stake. But it's still sending a message that first we're going to burn you in effigy. If you keep it up, then we're going to burn you. This tree that I mentioned, the Liberty Trees, were so named by a group of men called the Sons of Liberty, led in Boston by Samuel Adams. Adams was a young entrepreneur, inherited his family's brewing business, promptly ran it into the ground. He was better at politics than business, and he liked to stir the pot. And these groups, led by men like Adams, these Sons of Liberty, were popping up all over the colonies. They were groups that followed Locke's ideas and protested the government. Now, this is not the mass majority of the population yet, but it is a very vocal part of the population. In addition to their activities, a more widespread boycott on English goods was going on, and the women get involved in that. The women start making their own clothes. They start boycotting English tea and any other English goods. And that has more, the boycotts have more of an effect than anything. Because once you start hitting people in the pocketbook, they start reacting. And while the colonists didn't have representation in Parliament, the London merchants who weren't selling their goods most certainly did. And they were making their feelings known. Virginia, the Assembly wrote some resolves, basically wrote out on paper their complaints, sent them to England. This is when Patrick Henry gets all riled up and points out that, let me see if I can find the exact quote. We have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne. Yet such efforts have been met only by violence and insult. He ends his rant with, "But for me, give me liberty, or give that," showing the depth of feeling that these colonists had towards the king. In 1765, the colonists get together in what they call the Stamp Congress that ran from October 7th to October 25th. It was set up by the Massachusetts House of Representatives. They invited all of the colonists to send representatives to New York to discuss all of these new British laws. 27 delegates attend. Not every colony is represented, but most are there. And they write out a declaration of rights and grievances of the colonies. And they agree that the colonists should offer due subordination to the crown and to Parliament, but that taxes were a gift of the people, not a requirement, and that without representation in Parliament, these gifts could not be freely given. That it was up to their representative assemblies and not Parliament. Parliament responds in sort of a lukewarm method. Grenville gets ousted, not because he does anything wrong with the colonists. His policies there are fine, but he gets into a disagreement with King, and anybody who gets in disagreement with King George III is pretty much out on there behind. He's replaced by the Marquis of Rockingham, Charles Watson Wentworth, who was an actual Whig. He was a Whig of the old sort, and he sympathized with the colonists. Parliament was also being pressured by British merchants, and they concede. They repeal most of the laws, but they assert parliamentary control through the passage of the Declaratory Act. Sorry, that word didn't want to come out. The Declaratory Act asserts that Parliament has full powers to make laws that are binding to the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It's very vague. It avoids the use of the word tax, but it states they can make laws regardless for the colonies. The colonists are so happy that all the taxes are repealed that they're okay with this, and they don't really question it too much. There are people who realize what they just said, but they've won the battle. They're willing to concede a little. Wentworth doesn't stay as minister very long. Pitt comes back in. Remember, Pitt was the minister during the French and Indian Wars, but he's getting older and he's not quite as quick-witted as he had once been, and he is quickly replaced in 1767 by Charles Townshend. Now, Townshend is not a Whig. Townshend is a lot like King George. Townshend believes the colonists beneath him, holds most colonists, American and otherwise, in contempt, and he is determined that he's going to force obedience. So they get rid of one set of laws. 3 ministers later, they get a whole bunch of new ones. All right, let's go down to the next slide. The Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts reopened the whole tax issue. The Quartering Act had not been repealed. The Stamp Act had. And, excuse me, Townshend, through the King, through Parliament, suspends all the New York Assembly Acts until the Quartering Act is complied with. So New York now no longer has a representative assembly. except they do, because they keep meeting privately. They're not official, but they do keep meeting. The next act Townsend passed is the Revenue Act of 1767, which adds duties on the import of glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Things the colonists need. He also, okay, we're back. To make tax collection in the colonies more efficient. He expands the Vice Admiralty courts, and this actually, in a sense, benefits the colonists. They set up 4 courts, one in Halifax, one in Boston, one in Philadelphia, and one in Charleston. At least then, if you're going to get tried, you don't have to get drugged halfway across the Americas. So at least there's a court in each section of the country. And his acts work. They increase the revenues coming into the mother country. Tax collection gets more efficient. But the intangible costs are much higher than the kingdom can afford. They indirectly hurt the British merchants because people stop importing the things that they need from England. The taxes are collected, but they're collected in colonial courts, so that means more expense. But mostly because it leads to more conflict with the colonists. Colonists don't want to be taxed. Nobody wants to be taxed. And the colonists react more slowly than they did the Stamp Act, partially because the Townsend Acts hit certain areas more than they do. The Stamp Act was something that all of the colonists faced. Yeah, the Quartering Act, that's a New Yorker's problem. I'm in Virginia. I don't care. The commissioners in Boston are in Boston. But they do react. They start boycotting again. Women start forming what they call Daughters of Liberty. They boycott, they start making homespun. It becomes a matter of pride to make your own clothes, to clothe your own family. So weaving industries start up again, home weaving. They start protesting in the newspapers. And one set of letters stands out in particular. It's called the Dickinson Letters. They were written by a man named John Dickinson. He was the wealthy son of a banker and a Philadelphia lawyer. And he wrote 12 letters, which he titled Letter from a Philadelphia Farmer. Technically, he's a farmer, plantation. Late in 1767. And he uses persuasion rather than rhetoric to try to get his point across to Parliament and to the king. He puts forth similar arguments that they put forth during the Stamp Act protest. You know, hey, we don't have representation in Parliament. It's not fair to tax us for when we don't have representation. But he's a lawyer and he's a very eloquent writer. So it's a more eloquent, persuasive argument than just, burning effigies of stamp collectors. It's widely published. And it's more moderate. It's not as firebrand as what Samuel Adams would have written. And it persuades a lot more people. People tend to shy away from the extremes. And when you present your argument in a clear, moderate language, more people are going to react. You also have the Sons of Liberty rising back up. They aren't moderate. So Samuel Adams, which we talked about, ran the family brewery. He was a Harvard grad, and he, in 1668, along with a man named James Otis, wrote a letter for the Massachusetts legislature, politely and logically, but not moderately, explaining to Parliament that taxation without representation was wrong. Parliament demanded that the letter be withdrawn or the assembly would be dissolved. The assembly took the later choice, but much like in New York, they may have been dissolved legally, but they continued to meet. In 69, Virginia followed suit, calling the colonists to take up the cause. It was dissolved by the royal governor. But again, it starts meeting separately. Sorry, I had to look to see where we were on the slides. But in London, they're slow to react. Other things had kept the king busy, mostly reorganizing the government to his liking, i.e., kicking out anybody who offended, opposed, or he just didn't like, and surrounding himself with his friends, people who would, yes men, people who would tell him what he wanted to hear, and electing a new or appointing a new chief minister. So in 1770, the new chief minister, Lord North, comes in. North is now going to be the one in charge of, and he's not just in charge of the colonial governments, he's in charge of all of the government. He's the chief minister, basically what we call today the prime minister. All right. But he gets to react to what the colonists are doing. By 1770, the non-importation agreement, and we didn't really talk about that, but this is what the Daughters of Liberty and the Sons of Liberty really stress. Quit using British goods. They would sign pacts saying they would not import any goods. And it was starting to work. British merchants are hurting because they're not selling their goods in the colonies like they should be. And they start pressing Parliament again. Buys Townshend Acts, cuts back on a few things, but not all. And another issue that the colonists have is that Quartering Act. There are still troops in the colonies, and now they're being moved around. There are some in New York, there's some in Boston. They're kind of getting more scattered out, and wherever they are, the colonists have to provide them with housing and food. And it's starting to come to a head. And the first match is struck on March 5th, 1770, outside a Boston customs house. There are soldiers guarding the customs house. They are surrounded by a group of ruffians, basically, led by, or one of the leaders is a man named Crispus Attucks, who was a runaway mulatto slave who was working the docks in Boston. He and a bunch of other roughs gather around and start heckling the soldiers. Now, the soldiers are just standing there guarding the customs house. They're not really doing anything. But the heckling turns into rock throwing, and eventually somebody loses their cool and fires. 5 are left dead, 8 are wounded. Crispus is one of the dead. The soldiers involved are tried as murderers. They're defended by a man named John Adams, cousin to Samuel Adams, who is not quite as much of a firebrand, but he is still a patriot. They're starting to identify themselves more as Americans now, but he's also a lawyer, and he has to defend these soldiers. And he defends them and gets most of them off. He defends them as victims of circumstance, that they were heckled and drawn into this by a, quote, motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jacktars. And all but two are acquitted. And those two were convicted of manslaughter, and their punishment was to be branded on the thumb with an M. Stands for manslaughter or murderer. The whole episode shocks both the colonies and London. No one was quite ready for bloodshed. No one was quite ready for this to come to a head. On April 1770, in reaction, all of the Townshend Acts are repealed except for the tax on tea that's left as a token of authority, a face-saving device. And the non-importation movement fades because now they're not having to pay duties. They win, basically. Most of the Greenville Townshend Acts are still in effect. The Admiralty courts are still there. The Quartering Act is still there. But the worst of the taxes are gone. The Redcoats leave Boston, since that is the hotbed of activity, but they don't leave the colonies. They stay nearby in Massachusetts, and the Navy is still roaming the coastline looking for smugglers. They're still waiting for that spark. It's not quite there, but it's getting close. Now, let's talk about another group for a moment. Not in the colonies were interested in all of this patriotic garbage. The people in the backcountry had their own issues. There were rival land claims to some of this area that was opened up by the French and Indian Wars. The lands east of Lake Champlain were claimed both by New York and New Hampshire. Eventually, the area is going to become Vermont in 1777. It actually will become part of the country in 1791. Pennsylvania had arguments over land with both Virginia and Connecticut for parts of the Ohio River Valley. The backcountry was also having issues with Indians. Surprise, surprise, surprise. In Pennsylvania, in particular, vigilante law starts taking over in the 1760s. Virginia is run by the Quakers. Quakers are pacifists. The pacifists are not doing enough in the eyes of the backwoods people to protect them. And it comes to a head when a group of backwood farmers called the Paxton Boys massacre a peaceful tribe of Indians in Lancaster County. And then they threatened a group of Moravian Indians near Bethlehem. The Moravian Indians were a tribe that had converted to Christianity and were living in a town near Bethlehem. The Indians take refuge in Philadelphia, Philadelphia being the capital, and 1,500 Paxton boys march on the Capitol. You're about to have a militia war. But Benjamin Franklin diffuses the situation, sends the Paxton boys back to their farms, but the situation still persists. The Quakers pass a few laws that help, but they're pacifists. They're not going to raise a militia to attack the Indians. In South Carolina, folks felt underprotected as well. They reacted by refusing to pay taxes for services not rendered. And they demanded representation in the assembly because their areas were not assembled. And it was much the same argument that the colonists in Boston were using against the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. They organized groups called regulators, which were pretty much vigilante groups that would distribute frontier justice. In '69, the South Carolina Assembly did set up 6 circuit courts to give them better representation or better legal recourse, but they didn't include them in the representation. In North Carolina, there were protests of abuses by the government. The government, well, obviously refused to print money because now it's against the law, but they also refused to take produce or barter in exchange for taxes. They had lots of corn liquor, but they didn't have coin. So they organized the backward farmers organized to resist. They also formed regulator groups to dispense frontier justice, a lot of times at the expense of the tax collectors. And it comes to so much of a head that in 1771, Governor William Tyrone leads 1,200 militiamen to the Piedmont area to quell the regulators. They successfully defeat the regulators, but you still have this simmering resistance. To England, these disputes show that the colonists are not of one mind and convince the British authorities that the colonies were inherently unstable and that they required even firmer oversight. They kind of misread the situation. And the colonists are not of one mind at this point. There's a lot of things that are driving them together, but they still view each colony as its separate area. If you were from Virginia, you were a Virginian. If you were from Boston or Massachusetts, you were a Massachusetts citizen. If you were in New York, you were a New Yorker. They haven't come together yet as Americans. They're starting to refer to themselves as Americans, but they haven't come together. And there are a lot of people in the colonies that are still loyal to England. And pretty soon we're going to start calling them loyalists. And the lines are going to get more distinct as we go. Things are going to get worse in 72. Those French, sorry, I don't know why I came up with French. Those Navy men that are roaming the coast looking for smugglers run into some issues, particularly one ship in particular, the Gaspee. The Gaspee runs aground near Providence, Rhode Island. They're stuck. They can't go back out to sea. They're stuck on sandbar or whatever. And the ship's crew takes advantage of the local produce, confiscating cows, pigs, chickens, produce, whatever they need to feed themselves because they're stuck. It's a British schooner that was patrolling for smugglers. This angers the townspeople, of course, because you don't just come in and steal somebody's cows and go eat it. That's wrong. They respond by boarding the ship, removing the crew, and setting the schooner on fire. You know, a little payback. Authorities from England are sent to investigate. But surprise, surprise, there are no witnesses. No one saw anything. That's issue number 1 in 77. Or 70, not 77, 72. Next was some new financial arrangements. In June of 72, Governor Thomas Hutchinson told the Massachusetts Assembly his salary would now come from custom revenues, as with that of the judges of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Now, why is this an issue? Colonists don't have to pay the governor anymore. But if you're not paying the governor's not going to be loyal to you. Controlling the purse strings is a great political advantage. And Parliament, by restructuring the finances, cuts that string. So now you have this fear of a despotic administration that you can't control, but you can't control their pay. The Gaspee affair saw the Rhode Island courts circumvented by British authorities who sent in their own investigators into the episode. Like we said, the independent salaries for the government meant officials were loyal to London, not to home. And the colonists, not in Massachusetts, the ones in Virginia, the ones in Connecticut, because Vermont's not a colony yet, New York, Philadelphia, or Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina are looking and saying, they can do that to Massachusetts. What's going to keep them from doing the same thing here? Sam Adams steps up again and convinces Boston to form a committee on correspondence. Now, these committees on correspondence are groups that are going to be very important. Initially, there's one group, the one in Boston, and they issue a statement of grievances and rights, again, stating the same thing that they've stated before: no taxation without representation, and they invite other towns to do the same. In 73, the Virginia Assembly takes it one step forward and says, hey, we all have committees of correspondence now. We've all stated our rights to England. Let's use these committees of correspondence to connect to each other. Let's start writing in an intercolonial manner and networking, and that way we can mobilize public opinion and keep colonial resentment at a high level. And that was important, because if you could keep the pot stirred, keep it right below the boiling level, you could maybe get some changes made. Okay, we are going to stop there, because that alarm you heard was me saying class is almost out of time, and I can't get through the Boston Tea Party in 2 minutes. So we will pick up on Friday. I'll let you know if it's going to be here at ASU, but we'll pick up with the Boston Tea Party then. Y'all stay safe. Just on a side note, if you ever have to go get tested for COVID, they tell you it takes 2 to 3 days. Maybe not. We're on day 5 and we still haven't heard anything. I am healthy. I have no symptoms. I may be an asymptomatic carrier, but as far as I know, I don't have anything. But just to be safe, I'm going to keep doing this until I don't have to. So, and nobody checks on you like they say they're going to. So if you get tested and you need somebody to check on you, at least let me know. I may, I can email you every day and say, hey, are you still alive? So we will talk about this again later. Have a great day. And I'm hitting the end stream now. Bye.